It was a sweltering summer afternoon. Jayden, a young black boy no older than 17, was on his usual route home from school. His life wasn't easy, growing up in a rundown neighborhood with a single mother who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. But even with the struggles they faced, Jayden had a heart full of kindness, always willing to lend a helping hand where he could. As he turned the corner onto the highway, something caught his eye. A car, sleek and expensive, sat by the roadside, hood up, smoke rising from the engine. Beside it stood a woman, pacing back and forth, looking frustrated. She seemed out of place, her polished appearance starkly contrasting the rough surroundings. Jayden slowed his pace, taking in the scene. The woman, probably in her late 20s, was trying to make a call on her phone, but judging by her increasingly frantic gestures, she was getting no signal. Jayden hesitated for a moment. People from her world usually didn't want help from people like him. He knew that all too well, but his natural instinct to help won out. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Hey, you need some help." The woman, startled, turned sharply toward him. She eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Jayden could see the internal debate playing out on her face, whether to trust this boy from the neighborhood or keep her distance. I've broken down," she finally said, her voice tense. "My phone's not working, and I don't know what to do." Jayden nodded, stepping closer, but maintaining enough distance to not make her uncomfortable. He glanced at the engine, the problem obvious. He knew a thing or two about cars from working part-time at a garage. "Looks like your engine's overheated," Jayden said. "I can help you with it if you want." The woman hesitated again, then sighed, clearly too tired and stranded to argue. "All right," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him take a look. As Jayden tinkered with the car, the woman stood back, watching him cautiously. She crossed her arms, glancing nervously at her surroundings. It was clear this part of town was unfamiliar to her. After a few moments, Jayden spoke again, trying to break the tension. "I'm Jayden, by the way." The woman blinked, taken off guard by his sudden introduction. She nodded, offering a small, strained smile. "I'm Sarah." Jayden smiled back, despite her wariness. "Well, Sarah, you'll need to let the engine cool for a bit, but I can get it running again, no problem." She seemed to relax slightly, her guard lowering as she realized he meant no harm. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "I didn't know what I was going to do." As they waited for the engine to cool, Jayden and Sarah stood in awkward silence. He could feel her watching him, sizing him up. He didn't blame her. People like Sarah weren't used to people like him offering help, especially not in a place like this. But something in her gaze felt different. Not just suspicion, but something more, like she was searching for something she couldn't quite place. "So, you live around here?" Sarah finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah, not too far," Jayden replied, nodding toward the distant rooftops. "Been here all my life." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, as if the thought of growing up in this part of town puzzled her. "It must be tough," she said, her voice hesitant, like she didn't want to offend. Jayden shrugged. "It's home. You get used to it. Besides, it's not all bad." Sarah looked down at her feet, seemingly lost in thought. For a moment the conversation stalled again, but Jayden didn't mind. He was used to people like her feeling uncomfortable around him, even when he was only trying to help. "What about you?" Jayden asked, hoping to lighten the mood. "You from around here?" Sarah let out a small, humorless laugh. "No, definitely not." She paused, glancing at him before continuing. "I actually live a couple of cities away. I was just passing through." Jayden nodded. "What brought you out here?" There was a beat of silence before she spoke again, this time more quietly, more vulnerable. I'm looking for someone." Jayden raised his eyebrows, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "Someone? Like family?" Sarah hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, someone I haven't seen in a long time." Jayden could sense the emotion in her voice, the weight of whatever she wasn't saying hanging between them. He wanted to ask more, but something about her expression told him not to push. "Well," Jayden said, giving her a reassuring smile, "I hope you find them." Sarah looked at him then. really looked at him, as if she saw something familiar in his face that she hadn't noticed before. But she quickly averted her eyes, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Thanks," she murmured. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Jayden worked on Sarah's car, carefully checking the engine. Sarah sat on the car's hood, watching him in silence for a while, her mind clearly somewhere else. "What kind of person are you looking for?" Jayden asked, trying to keep the conversation going, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if debating whether to answer. "It's, complicated," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been looking for my family. I haven't seen them in years." Jayden glanced up, surprised. "Years? Why? What happened?" Sarah exhaled, her shoulders dropping as if she had been carrying the weight of that question for a long time. "I was adopted when I was little," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My brother and I got separated. I've been trying to find him ever since." Jayden straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, his heart suddenly feeling heavier. He didn't know what to say. He knew how it felt to grow up without knowing family, to have questions that no one seemed to have the answers to. "That's tough," Jayden said softly. "I can't imagine what that's like." Sarah gave a sad smile. "Yeah, it's been hard. I've been searching for years, but no luck. Every lead turns into a dead end." For a moment, Jayden felt a deep connection to Sarah. Even though their lives seemed so different, they both understood what it meant to be without family, to live with that emptiness. His mother had always done her best, but there was a part of him that still wondered about his past, about the father he never knew, and the questions about his own roots that no one could answer. "I'm sorry you haven't found him," Jayden said, sincerity in his voice. "But you'll find him. You seem like someone who doesn't give up easily." Sarah looked at him then, a glimmer of hope crossing her face. "Thanks," she said quietly. "That means a lot." With the car finally cooling down, Jayden continued to work on it while Sarah stood nearby. The conversation between them grew more comfortable, their earlier awkwardness dissolving as they opened up to each other. But there was something else now, a strange familiarity Sarah couldn't shake. Something about the way Jayden spoke, the way he carried himself, felt oddly familiar, like she had met him before. "So do you have any siblings?" Sarah asked, her voice casual but curious. Jayden paused for a moment before shaking his head. "Not that I know of. My mom raised me on her own. I never knew my dad, and I've never heard of any brothers or sisters." Sarah frowned slightly, a pang of disappointment in her chest. "Oh," she said softly, trying to mask the sadness in her voice. "I see." Jayden noticed the shift in her tone and glanced up. "Why do you ask?" Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to say what was on her mind. She had been searching for her brother for so long, clinging to every small hope. And now, standing next to Jayden, she couldn't help but wonder if fate had brought them together for a reason. "I don't know," she admitted. I don't know if it's just me, but there's something about you that feels familiar. Like we've crossed paths before somehow." Jayden laughed softly, though there was a hint of unease behind it. "Maybe we did in another life." Sarah chuckled, but the unease lingered between them, like an unspoken truth neither of them was ready to acknowledge. The car sputtered to life again, and Jayden stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "There you go," he said with a grin. "All fixed." Sarah smiled gratefully. "I don't know how to thank you. You've been a real lifesaver." Jayden shrugged, brushing off the compliment. "It's no big deal. I just did what anyone would do." As Sarah climbed back into her car, she looked at Jayden once more, that strange feeling gnawing at her again. "I don't know why, but you remind me of someone important." Jayden smiled awkwardly, waving off the comment. "Maybe I just have one of those faces." Sarah laughed softly, but the moment stayed with her, lingering like a shadow. She drove away, glancing at Jayden in the rearview mirror, that sense of familiarity haunting her all the way down the road. Days passed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her encounter with Jayden replayed in her mind over and over again. That strange familiarity gnawed at her, and she couldn't help but think about her brother, the one she'd been searching for so long. Could it be possible that Jayden was him? The thought seemed ridiculous, but her heart kept pulling her back to that idea. Determined to find out more, Sarah did some research. She remembered Jayden mentioning his mom, and it wasn't too difficult to find her name in some local records. After all, their neighborhood was small, and news traveled fast. She learned more about Jayden's mother, her struggles, and the fact that she had adopted Jayden when he was just a baby. The pieces started falling into place, and Sarah's heart raced as the truth became more and more clear. One evening, she sat on her bed, staring at an old photo she had carried with her for years. It was a picture of her and her brother, taken before they were separated. The little boy in the photo had a bright, infectious smile. His eyes, dark and full of curiosity, reminded her of someone she had met only days ago. Her heart pounded in her chest as the possibility hit her like a wave. Could Jayden be her brother? Without a second thought, Sarah grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she had found earlier. After a few rings, Jayden answered, his voice familiar and steady. "Hello? Jayden, it's Sarah," she said, her voice tight with nervousness. "Oh, hey, what's up?" Jayden replied, sounding surprised but pleased to hear from her. I need to talk to you about something important," Sarah said, her heart pounding in her chest. "Can we meet up?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, but Jayden finally agreed. "Yeah, sure. Where do you want to meet?" They arranged to meet at a local cafe the next day, and Sarah spent the rest of the night trying to calm her racing thoughts. If she was right, her entire world was about to change. The next afternoon, Sarah arrived at the cafe early, her mind racing with questions and emotions she could barely contain. Jayden showed up shortly after, walking in with his usual laid-back demeanor, unaware of the life-altering conversation that was about to take place. "Hey," he greeted her with a smile, sliding into the seat across from her. "You sounded serious on the phone. What's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out the old photograph. She placed it on the table between them, watching as Jayden's eyes flicked down to the image. "Jayden," she began, her voice unsteady, "I need to ask you something. Do you recognize this picture?" Jayden's brow furrowed as he picked up the photo, his eyes scanning it with curiosity. The image showed two young children, Sarah and her brother, smiling brightly at the camera. He stared at the picture for a long time before shaking his head, clearly confused. I don't know these kids," he said, his voice uncertain. "Why? Who are they?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "That's me," she said quietly, pointing to the little girl in the photo. "And that boy is my brother. We were separated when we were young. I've been looking for him for years." Jayden stared at her, the weight of her words starting to sink in. "Wait, what are you saying?" "I think you might be him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think you're my brother." Jayden's eyes widened, shock and disbelief washing over him. He looked back down at the photo, then back at Sarah, his mind racing. "That can't be right," he said, shaking his head. "I was adopted. My mom, she never told me anything about a sister." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Jayden, I've been searching for you my whole life. I know it sounds crazy, but everything matches. Your age, where you were adopted, your mother, it all lines up. I think we were separated when we were little. I think you're the one I've been looking for." Jayden sat back in his chair, his world spinning. The boy who had grown up without knowing his true family, who had always wondered about his past, was now faced with the possibility that the woman sitting in front of him was his long-lost sister. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Jayden struggled to process the flood of emotions that crashed over him: shock, disbelief, confusion, and, somewhere deep down, hope. Hope that the missing piece of his life had finally been found. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice shaky, If what you're saying is true, I don't even know what to say." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "We'll figure it out together. We're family, Jayden, and nothing can change that." Jayden sat in silence, his mind racing as the reality of Sarah's words settled in. He had spent his whole life without knowing his true family, never thinking that someone out there might be looking for him. The idea that this woman sitting across from him could be his sister, it was overwhelming. "How do we know for sure?" Jayden finally asked, his voice quiet and uncertain. "What if we're wrong?" Sarah understood his hesitation. She had spent so many years chasing down false leads, hoping against hope that she would find her brother, only to be disappointed. But this time, she felt it in her heart. This was different. "There are ways to be sure," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. "We can take a DNA test. But Jayden, in my heart, I already know. I've been searching for so long, and everything about you, everything about where you come from, it all lines up. I feel like I've known you my whole life, even though we've only just met." Jayden leaned back in his chair, his emotions swirling. He didn't know how to feel. The boy who had grown up thinking he was alone, that he had no family outside of his mother, was suddenly faced with the possibility of a sister, someone who had been searching for him, missing him, for years. "I don't even know what to say," Jayden murmured, rubbing his hands over his face. "This is a lot." Sarah gave him a sad smile, understanding the whirlwind of emotions he was going through. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said softly. "We don't have to rush into anything. But Jayden, if you're willing, I'd like to get to know you, to figure this out together." Jayden nodded slowly. It was a strange feeling, hope mixed with fear, excitement mixed with uncertainty. He had always wondered about his past, about where he came from, and now the answers were right in front of him, but he also felt a deep loyalty to the woman who had raised him, his mother, who had adopted him and given him everything she could. "My mom, she's the only family I've ever known," Jayden said, his voice thick with emotion. What if this changes everything?" Sarah's eyes softened. "It doesn't have to," she said gently. "I'm not here to take anything away from you, Jayden. Your mother will always be your mother, but I hope that we can be a part of each other's lives too. You deserve to know where you come from, and I want to know the brother I've been missing all these years." Jayden nodded, though the weight of the revelation still pressed on him. He wasn't sure how he felt yet, but there was something undeniable in Sarah's words. A connection that went beyond what either of them could explain. A few weeks later, Jayden and Sarah stood in the same cafe where they had first met, staring down at a small white envelope. Inside was the answer that would confirm what both of them had felt all along. They had taken the DNA test, and now the results were in. Jayden's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope. Sarah, standing beside him, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her own heart racing. They both knew what they were about to find, but seeing it in writing would make it real. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jayden nodded, though he wasn't sure if anyone could ever really be ready for a moment like this. Slowly, he opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. His eyes scanned the results, and in that moment, the truth became undeniable. A soft gasp escaped Sarah's lips as she looked at the paper over his shoulder. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she covered her mouth with her hand, her emotions overwhelming her. "It's true," Jayden whispered, his voice shaky with disbelief. "We're siblings." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The cafe around them faded into the background as they stood there, two people who had been separated by life, but were now reunited by fate. Jayden felt a rush of emotions, relief, joy, and a strange sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. Sarah threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly as tears streamed down her face. "I knew it," she whispered through her sobs. "I knew you were my brother." Jayden hugged her back, his own eyes damp as the reality of it all finally sank in. He wasn't alone. After all these years of wondering about his past, he had found his sister, his family. The feeling was overwhelming, but it was also the start of something new, something he had never expected, but now couldn't imagine his life without. They pulled back from the hug, both wiping away their tears, laughing through the emotions. "I don't even know where to begin," Jayden said, smiling despite the tears in his eyes. "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, her voice full of warmth. "We have time now. We have each other." Over the next few months, Jayden and Sarah worked to rebuild the bond that had been lost for so long. Jayden introduced Sarah to his mother, who, despite her initial surprise, welcomed Sarah into their lives with open arms. The three of them began to form a new kind of family, one built not just on blood, but on love and understanding. Jayden's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. The boy who had once felt so alone now had a sister who had been searching for him his whole life, and while their journey had only just begun, they both knew that they were no longer walking it alone. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset from the porch of Jayden's home, Sarah turned to him with a smile. "Can you believe it?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "After all these years, we found each other." Jayden smiled back, the warmth of her presence filling a void he had never been able to name. "I guess some things are just meant to be." And in that moment, under the fading light of the setting sun, Jayden knew that no matter where life took them, they would always have each other, a new beginning, a new family, together.